Here's a pretty simplified sentence summing up the general state of JRPGs in the 16-bit era, as most people have always thought of it anyway. In Japan, there's lots of them, duh, with them being as common as football games in the West. In the US, well, they didn't get all of them, but they certainly got a chunk, and those games are often thought of as the best of the whole era. And in Europe, particularly the UK, nothing. Silence. Tumbleweeds. Before Final Fantasy VII came along on PS1, we didn't know what a Japanese role-playing game even was to amaze us slack-jawed yokels with its turn-based combat, staggering graphics, epic stories and so forth. That's the usual knowledge, and it's what a lot of folks on YouTube have gone with. Hell, I've gone with it in the past too. But of course, there is a bit more to it than that, isn't there? In fact, there's a lot more to it. To say that nobody over here knew anything about JRPGs before the PlayStation came along would be, in fact, pretty much a total fib, because there were people out there who did know about them, and who championed them utterly. And yes, there were places where you could buy them. Not the big chain stores, of course, but they were most certainly around. And so, here's a little attempt to piece some things together when it comes to the history of JRPGs in the UK before Final Fantasy VII came along, to see how well we knew games like Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, Earthbound, Super Mario RPG, and others that officially never reached these shores. A large amount of this will be devoted to looking at one of the best remembered and greatest video game magazines of the whole era. So first off, well, what exactly did we end up getting, officially? When it comes to the Mega Drive and the SNES anyway. If you were a Mega Drive owner and you stuck rigidly to the shelves of Future Zone or WH Smith or wherever, largely speaking you had most of the big options that the Americans had, although they all probably came out a bit later. All the Phantasy Star games, for example, saw European release, even if they were normally a few months behind the American versions. Still, we got them. And they had their fans, for sure. Initially, Sega said that they didn't have plans to publish Phantasy Star 4 in Europe, but calls from the RPG lovers and a campaign from Mean Machine Sega forced their hand, and the end of the millennium arrived in December of 1995. Shining Force? Yeah, we got all of those games, the two big strategy RPGs, as well as the precursor Shining in the Darkness and Shining Force CD. And of course there's plenty of action RPGs. We did get the likes of Crusader of Senti and Beyond Oasis, renamed Soleil and The Story of Four respectively. Obviously we didn't get everything. Those who might have wanted games like Warson or East 3 or whatever would have had to take a trip to an import store, and we didn't get Working Designs games like Luna for the Mega CD either. But still, we got most of the big ones. Even Super Bloody Hardalite came out in Europe, for Christ's sake. That said, even if there are a couple of absolutely glorious examples, the Mega Drive isn't where the JRPGs are at, generally speaking. As much as I love Phantasy Star 4 and think it's one of the best games there's ever been, I would have to be a right dunderhead to claim that Sega's machine is even remotely on par with the SNES for these games because of it. And on the SNES in the PAL territories? Well, things get a bit murkier. You might be surprised at some of the ones that did get an official release, as opposed to the big games like, well, Final Fantasy, or even Mario RPG that did not. As you might expect, most of the big JRPGs released on the SNES in Europe are firmly in the action camp, whether it's the earlier and barely remembered likes of Lagoon, the Quintet trilogy that comprises of Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia and Terranigma, or Square's own Secret of Mana. All of the aforementioned games are expansions upon the Zelda-esque action RPG formula, with not a turn-based battle to be found in any of them. However, there was one point where Nintendo did try and introduce the classic turn-based JRPG to European shores, although it didn't really end up sticking for various reasons. Now you may know this one already. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, known as Mystic Quest Legend in Europe, is technically the second Final Fantasy game to be released in Europe. Or to be more accurate, it's part of a duo that also included Final Fantasy Adventure on the Game Boy, also known as Mystic Quest in Europe, and a game that's actually the first entry in the Seiken Densetsu series. Confusing, isn't it? Anyway, this game came out in 1993, and the European wing of Nintendo went all in on promoting the game as the beginner's introduction to JRPGs, in much the same way as it was pushed in other territories. Said pushing included all sorts of primers on how the turn-based RPG worked, introductions to menus, the concepts of battling randomly in the fields. It's all designed to educate players who knew absolutely nothing and needed to be spoon-fed all these details, and, well, looking back on it, yeah, it might have come across as a little condescending. It's not as if Mystic Quest is a bad game or anything like that, it's a perfectly fine beginner's JRPG, but a lot of the Western marketing for the game in particular concentrates almost entirely on the game being some sort of extended tutorial for the JRPG genre, as opposed to something like, I don't know, going on a big adventure with a suitably epic story and drama that might actually make the game more appealing. I mean, would you want to buy a game that's presented as nothing but a tutorial? I don't think so. Anyway, Mystic Quest flopped in Europe, as it did basically everywhere else, and from there, well, the genre kind of ignored the territory completely. No one wanted to put the effort in to translate a big JRPG, it seemed, especially if the process might well have required more than one language. The whole thing was written off as a lost cause. But some people did play Mystic Quest Legend, and they enjoyed it, and they most certainly wanted more. It's those people that kept the JRPG flame alive through the 16-bit years on the SNES, and one magazine in particular would become a champion for these games, appealing to the companies to make that effort and bring JRPGs over to these shores, and encouraging their readers to hit the import shops and do whatever they could in order to play these games, even in some cases if they hadn't yet even been translated into English and released in the States. The magazine in question was the legendary Superplay, Future Publishing's entry into the SNES mag market, and one of the best remembered publications of the whole 16-bit era. Why was Superplay so loved, and why is it remembered so well compared to a lot of its contemporary magazines, whether they were SNES focused or otherwise? Now this is quite easy to answer, actually, because it was completely different to the rest. Not just in the style of writing or the art or anything like that, but in the sort of games that it covered. Right from the beginning, it knew that in many ways, SNES owners in the UK and Europe were getting a bit of a raw deal when it came to video games, and it encouraged its reader base to go and seek out SNES and Super Famicom games from around the world. The market for import SNES games in the UK would certainly have been a hell of a lot smaller if it wasn't for their utterly dedicated coverage of them and their passionate entreaties to their fans. These games may not have been officially released, but they're out there and you can play them too. You've just got to look for them. In taking this approach, Superplay, under its trio of editors, Matt Bilby, James Leach and finally Alison Harper, also nurtured a crossover with a group of people who probably already had a bit of experience when it came to seeking out imports and having to venture away from the more traditional routes of buying what they wanted. That being anime and manga fans, who'd already spent years getting their fix and finding shows that hadn't yet officially been released in the territory. Superplay recognised the crossover in audiences between anime and video games, and they nurtured it from the off. Monthly features dedicated to anime, trips to Akihabara, all sorts of other content from their men in Tokyo that would please otakus, and a unique art style. The front covers and the drawings in the mag, headed up largely by art editor Lisa Nichols and designer Will Overton, were very much inspired by manga, and most certainly stuck out from the shelves in much the same way as the legendary Oliver Phrase covers for newsfield magazines did in the 1980s. Some could sniffily describe the content of the magazine as being niche, but it was perhaps a lot broader than others would give it credit for, not least because it refused to stick its head in the sand and pretend that European SNES players were getting the same games as the Americans and Japanese were, when clearly that wasn't the case. Right from the magazine's first issue, it set out its stall. The magazine's going to give import games as much, if not more time than UK releases, recognising that imports are out there, along with the adapters required to play them, and it's going to treat you as somebody who's going to be pretty considered with the cash you're putting down on a SNES game. A fair bit more than a Mega Drive one, it has to be said, and it will give you the information and critique you need for all sorts of games on the system, both new and old. You want to know what the best adapter for these games is? You want to know who's out there selling imports and the best sources to buy certain games? Superplay has certainly got you covered. More than anything else, however, Superplay is probably best remembered for its extensive JRPG coverage. Again, right from the start, the magazine wanted to get its audience into the genre and make people aware of it, with the hope that eventually companies like Nintendo and Square would listen to them and start actually releasing these games in Powland. They went as far as to encourage fans to send in postcards saying that they wanted RPGs that they could lend forward to Nintendo, and they got a lot of them. The extensive coverage from Japan soon comes thick and fast in the mag's pages. The second issue features a big report on a recent Tokyo Nintendo show by a certain obscure journalist named Peter Molyneux, with a fair bit of talk surrounding the ultra-successful Dragon Quest V. The next issue features 2 whole pages dedicated to Enix's game and the popularity of a series that hadn't officially reached our shores, with the expectation that an American release of the first SNES game in the series will be coming soon, which sadly never happened. The 7th issue of the mag features a whole primer on Japanese RPGs that includes damn near everything a newbie would need to know and then some, from the differences between JRPGs and Western RPGs like Dungeon Master and what have you, to what the Japanese audiences look for in a good one, and a summary of the big ones that Japanese gamers were playing right now. Names like Elferia, Albert Odyssey, Dragon Slayer and Dual Orb 2 that you would never even dream of seeing in other magazines. This guide soon becomes a monthly feature called Fantasy Quest, complete with all the latest JRPG news, looks at what's out, and the likelihood of the games getting any kind of translation. Hopefully you get the picture a little bit here. Between the monthly import charts, the looks at various aspects of Japanese culture, and the extensive coverage of a genre that was filled with games that required a whole load of navigation through Japanese text boxes, the magazine was pretty damn ambitious. It had a remit of trying to cover damn near everything, and it would usually achieve it. Between all the Japanese and American releases each month, not to mention the actual official UK games, they had a hell of a lot of games to cover in their usual 100+ pages, and all things considered, they wouldn't do too bad a job of doing so. And the JRPG coverage would always be there, only getting bigger over time, especially when the magazine knew that a game was absolutely and definitely going to at least get an English translation and an American release. Which brings us neatly to a game like Final Fantasy VI, which is most certainly the main game I want to talk about here. What's the common narrative here again? That nobody knew about this game or this series until the release of that PS1 game featuring the antics of Cloud Strife and a bunch of eco-warriors? Yeah, one look at Superplay reveals that is not really the case. Obviously the games of Square were always going to be a big talking point in a magazine like this. There's always the sense that of all the makers of these games, they're just the ones that are way up there, them and Enix. Superplay kind of missed the boat on the American release of Final Fantasy IV, seeing as it predated the debut of the magazine by nearly a year, but when Final Fantasy VI was on its way to the USA in late '94, as Final Fantasy III, well, the magazine wasn't going to undersell it. Indeed, the second half of 1994 would see a wholesale burst of JRPG releases and antics. September saw an interview with Ted Woolsey, Square's translator on Secret of Mana, where he felt that it was likely that more RPGs would now start making it to Western shores, specifically European ones. In October, the front cover was dedicated to the American release of Breath of Fire, a Capcom RPG that a year and a half ago, when interviewed in the same magazine, Capcom of America's Joe Morici had said that there were no plans to bring outside of Japan, but now were able to with the help of Square of America. This was seen as quite indicative of the growing momentum behind the genre outside Japan. November sees a big feature on Secret of Mana, celebrating its release in the UK, the US version already having picked up 94% a year previously, as well as previews for a certain game by the name of Chrono Trigger. And then you get to December. Now keep in mind that this is the Christmas issue, and that you might expect some of the big official hitters of the season to feature heavily, I don't know, a small game like Donkey Kong Country or something. But in Superplay, this is the front cover. Final Fantasy III takes centre stage, with a front cover and a big detailed review in which the game scores 95%, being proclaimed the best RPG on the SNES and thusly one of the best video games ever by Tony Mott. It's a passionate review that leaves nothing out in telling people that they have to play this game. I mean, it doesn't say that you're stupid if you don't get it, but it's as shining a review as they come. And did it work? Well, from what's out there, it most certainly did. Final Fantasy III was absolutely one of the most in-demand imports for most of 1995, with various other RPGs also dominating the magazine's list of the UK's top imports titles, from Illusion of Gaia to Ogre Battle, to the even bigger releases of the likes of Earthbound and Chrono Trigger later in the year. Now, while we're dealing with a grey market here, and there's obviously no official Gallup sales, it's clear that when it came to the people who were buying imports for the SNES, JRPGs were right up at the very top of what they wanted. And Lord knows people were certainly already chomping at the bit for news on the next Final Fantasy game that was apparently going to be launching the Ultra 64 at the end of 1995. Speaking of Chrono Trigger, that too was subject to a massive feature and a spot on the cover in June of 1995, hyping it up appropriately as the biggest Square project to date. All this and potentially plenty more games to come. You've got Super Mario RPG on the horizon. There's games that are actually coming to the UK now, even if they're a fair bit late, such as Breath of Fire 2 and Lufia 2 Rise of the Sinistrals. Things are most definitely happening. As we enter 1996, there's quite clearly a fair bit of momentum behind the JRPG genre, the sort that's slowly gathered over the years. And really, you should expect that momentum to finally be acknowledged with the official release of some of the genre's biggest games. You have to imagine, after all, that if the likes of Breath of Fire 2 or Lufia 2, games that were very much in the chasing pack, are starting to get official releases, that they'd be there alongside the much bigger ones, the Final Fantasy III, the Chrono Trigger, Super Mario RPG or whatever. But of course, none of these games ended up getting an official release in Europe. And you would perhaps expect that they would, even if such things are never totally sure, as the example of Trials of Mana proved. Following the release of Secret of Mana and other successful RPGs, people might have expected the third Seiken Densetsu game to get a Western release. But it didn't. The bigwigs in Japan decided not to spend 6 months translating the game and cleaning up bugs in order to get it ready for the West, as it was seen as too much effort for comparatively little gain at such a late hour. Contrary to popular belief at the time, the decision had nothing to do with the exclusively Western-produced and released Secret of Evermore, the first and indeed only game developed by Square exclusively in North America. No matter the reason behind it, however, the lack of Secret of Mana 2 in the West was seen as a bit of a blow after the joys of 1995. What is most certainly clear though, is that the decision to ultimately not release these huge games in Europe most certainly goes a whole lot deeper than the old chestnut of Europeans and Brits not being interested in JRPGs. In many ways, it does seem like a case of joining the dots and looking at an issue that's far bigger than the matter of European translations for Japanese RPGs, that being the complete collapse of Square and Nintendo's relationship over the Nintendo 64's hardware, and their jump over to Sony and the PlayStation. This happened in the early spring of 1996, just as the likes of Super Mario RPG were hitting the shelves, and all projects that the company had for the SNES were immediately binned. Japanese exclusives Treasure Hunter G and Treasure of the Rudras, along with the American release of Super Mario RPG, just about survived and were released in May, and well, that was it. With this in mind, and with the knowledge that a European release of a game would always be at the very least 6 months behind an American one, if not more, it's easy to see that none of those games would have got out in time. This is an educated guess, and the whims of companies don't necessarily make this a sure thing, but it does seem likely that a game such as Super Mario RPG would have come out in Europe under normal circumstances, if only because of the guy on the cover. However, with the collapse of everything, the N64 on the horizon, and Nintendo more than likely wanting to strike Square's name utterly from their records, it did not. Looking back on Superplay's reporting of this news, they naturally took it all pretty soberly, and were quite sad about the whole thing, but still wished Square all the success in the world with their new direction, even printing some of the early screenshots of Final Fantasy VII along with the news. And they certainly made sure to run the Final Fantasy forum all the way to the end, a place that was devoted specifically to Square's JRPGs and primarily consisted of a huge walkthrough of Final Fantasy III that was spread out over 14 whole months, along with readers sharing tips and what have you. It also included a detailed description and rundown of the game's ending in April 1996, which might seem somewhat odd to folks who think that a walkthrough of such a story-driven game shouldn't include such huge spoilers. But then, there were extenuating circumstances. One rather cruel twist of fate for FF3 lovers in the UK, you see, was that the game struggled to run on 50Hz systems due to Square's programming techniques. There were more or less bugs depending on what adapter you were using, some minor and some major, but one thing they basically all had in common was that the screen would go totally black on reaching the end of the game, at best only playing through the music. The letter pages were, again, filled with people highlighting this huge problem, as well as some who'd claimed they'd found solutions, but, well, not much was to be done about it in the end except to, eventually, print it in the magazine, when there was no hope of the game being released here at all. A bit of a bummer, as you might imagine. Superplay printed its 47th and last issue in September of 1996, not quite at the end of the SNES's life to be sure, but Future were presumably keen to restructure things at the time, what with the same time period also seeing the departure of other mags, whether they were legendary ones like Amiga Power, or the slightly less remembered likes of Ultimate Future Games. The magazine's natural successor came in April 97 with the launch of N64 magazine, a mag that retained a whole bunch of the same staff, but while there were certainly similarities between the two publications, there were plenty of differences too. In the end, however, Superplay's efforts to promote imports and in particular the Japanese RPG certainly weren't in vain. I think it's important to note that the huge success of a game like Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation didn't just happen in a vacuum, especially not in the European territory that would be responsible for a good 2 million or so of the game's sales. It's not right to say that before FF7 there was nothing. It was the groundwork laid by Superplay and magazines like it that really helped to give Final Fantasy a huge boost, the word of mouth it helped spread, and the grassroots campaigns they tried to engineer amongst the system's dedicated and older fanbases. They certainly promoted Final Fantasy III or VI or whatever more than perhaps any other title in the publication's history, and they made people absolutely gaga for the potential new Final Fantasy game that was coming, even when it was clear that it was going to be on PlayStation. It's this effort that helped give the game the momentum it needed and made sure that FF7 was unquestionably going to be out everywhere, complete with a huge advertising campaign. It's not just a whole new experience, it's the game that plenty of you have waited years for. If it hadn't been for these efforts, well, perhaps that pathway to huge success and the JRPG boom that followed gets a little bit tougher. You can certainly also look at the American magazines like GamePro and particularly Die Hard Game Fan that also heavily championed RPGs and import gaming. They also had their part to play in the States, that's for sure. But Superplay really achieved an awful lot to create a market where, as far as official releases go, there were barely even crumbs to be found. It is an important legacy, and it's why they deserve to be amongst the UK's greatest video game magazines. Bye for now.